You, Hercule Poirot, and the painting that disappeared without a trace. Chapter 1. The Phantom Painting. The rain was falling steadily on the rooftops of the Rue de Varennes, in the elegant 7th arrondissement of Paris, when the call reached Hercule Poirot's office. The Belgian detective, recently settled after a brief stay in London, was reorganizing his personal files, a task that required, he believed, both precision and aesthetic sense. It was a grey afternoon, one of those that invites steaming tea and introspective thought. "Poirot, there's someone on the telephone," announced his new assistant, the young and excessively punctual Léon Marchand. "It's Madame Élise Morel, from the Galerie Vernet." Poirot raised an eyebrow, placing the comb with which he adjusted the angle of his moustache on a silver tray. "The same Vernet gallery that houses the Chastel collection." "The same, sir." Poirot leaned toward the receiver of the old-fashioned telephone he kept out of choice, not necessity. "Madame Morel," he greeted cordially, "what artistic tragedy has disturbed your impeccable sense of order?" The voice on the other end was tense, though he tried to maintain his composure. "Monsieur Poirot, I need your help. This morning, during the routine check prior to tonight's gala, we discovered that a painting has disappeared. No sign of forced entry, no cameras capturing anything, no witnesses. Simply, it's not there." Poirot remained silent for a few seconds. "And what painting, if I may ask?" "The Lady in Blue, by Edgar Delamere. A unique work, valued at nearly 2,000,000 francs. It belonged to the Chastel family on exclusive loan. If we don't recover it before tonight's gala, it will be a devastating scandal. My God, a robbery without a trace and with limited time to solve it. Voilà, madame. Poirot will come immediately." The Galerie Vernet was a neoclassical gem located in a building that exuded history and lineage. Upon arrival, Poirot was greeted by Élise Morel, a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with the poise of someone who had learned to deal with magnates, dealers, and artistic vanities alike. Beside her, a burly man with a face like marble watched them, Etienne Lemoine, the gallery's head of security. "I'll show you the room," Madame Morel said hurriedly. "Everything was in order last night, as always. This morning, when we opened to prepare for the exhibition, the painting was not in its place." The Chastel room was a large space, adorned with gilt frames, indirect lighting, and a reverential silence. Poirot paused in front of the empty space on the wall. The marks from the painting were still visible on the velvet background. There were no fingerprints, broken glass, or any clutter. "The alarm?" asked Poirot. "Intact," Lemoine said in a deep voice. "It wasn't activated at any time." Poirot walked around the room like someone examining a play before the final act. Then he turned his gaze to Élise. "Tell me, madam, who had access to the security system?" "Just me, Etienne, and our night technician, Paul Leclerc." "And the employees?" 3 assembly assistants, 2 art curators, and Mr. Maurice Chastel, who came yesterday afternoon to inspect your collection. No one else." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "So we have a missing work with no forced entry, with restricted access and a limited circle of people. Very well, madame. Poirot will handle it. But I warn you, where everyone else is looking for the invisible, I will be looking for the incongruous." Élise looked at him with worried eyes. "Do you think you'll get it back in time for the gala?" Madame, Poirot said with a brief smile, smoothing his moustache, pictures can disappear, but lies always leave a frame. And so, as Paris continued to shed a light rain, Poirot began a new dance with the truth. The mystery of the painting that vanished without a trace had just begun. Chapter 2. Eyes in the Gallery. Poirot requested a complete list of everyone present in the gallery over the past 24 hours. Leather notebook in hand, pen carefully aligned in the margins, he sat down in an armchair in the lobby, directly opposite a marble bust that regarded him with a stern expression. "Let's begin with you, Madame Morel," said Poirot, crossing his legs with mathematical precision. "What time did you retire last night?" "A little before 9. I personally checked the room, and everything was in place." Then Etienne closed the gallery as usual. "And Mr. Chastel, what time did he leave?" "Just before me." "He was in a bad mood, as usual. He was complaining about the place of his painting in the general layout. He said that the lady in blue deserved the absolute centre." Poirot tilted his head. "Did it bother you that it shared a room with other works?" "Very much so. Mr. Chastel is eccentric, but his prestige is useful." Poirot made a note and looked, up at Etienne Lemoine. "And you, sir, who was in charge of the closing?" "Myself, like every night. I checked all the doors, tested the motion sensors, and armed the alarm at 9:12 p.m. And your night technician, Paul Leclerc, arrived at 10:15 p.m. His job is to monitor cameras and systems from the control room. He doesn't leave his post until 6 a.m. And you didn't see anything unusual?" "According to him, no. We checked the system this morning. No alerts, no entries logged." Poirot frowned slightly, the gesture barely visible under his moustache. "May I speak to Monsieur Leclerc? He's upstairs. I'll call him." While they waited, Poirot stood up and walked over to a nearby painting, a bucolic landscape with a small mill. He gently touched the frame. "Funny," he murmured. "What's going on?" Elise asked, worried. "Nothing. It's just that some frames have a more complex story than the painting they contain. It makes me think." At that moment, Paul Leclerc arrived. He was a young man with a thin build, dark circles under his eyes, and a distant gaze. He nervously rubbed his hands together. "Monsieur Poirot, I was told you wanted to speak to me. But we've already checked everything honestly. There are no anomalous records." Poirot watched him for a moment in silence. "Have you worked here long, Monsieur Leclerc?" 3 years, always on the night shift. It must be lonely. Silence, art everywhere, and the temptation not to be noticed." Paul tensed. "I would never play a piece. Never. Not even when we're alone." Poirot nodded, satisfied that he had provoked a clear reaction. "Calm down, sir. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just observing." "Tell me, did you see anyone else last night?" "No. No one came in. No one came out, I swear." Poirot bowed his thanks slightly. When Paul left, he sat back down opposite Elise and Etienne. "I'd like to see the full camera footage from last night through this morning." Etienne nodded. "We will send you a copy immediately." Poirot nodded, then murmured. A painting vanished without a trace. A disgruntled owner. A nervous technician. And yet Everything seems too perfect, as if someone had planned not the theft, but the illusion that it never existed. He stood up gently. "Madam, before I go for now, one last thing. Was the painting insured?" Elise swayed. "Yes, but for less than its actual value." Maurice Chastel refused to fully insure it, saying that no one would dare touch it in his presence. Poirot gave a slight, almost invisible smile. "Ah, the vanity of the collector! Sometimes it protects more than the most solid of safes, until it doesn't." And with that thought, the detective headed toward the exit, while his mind began to weave the first invisible connections between an empty frame, wounded pride, and a robbery that perhaps wasn't even a robbery. Chapter 3. The Pride of the Chastel. The next morning Poirot arrived punctually at the Hôtel Saint-Honoré, where Maurice Chastel, heir to the renowned family that for generations had amassed one of France's most coveted private art collections, was temporarily residing. The receptionist, seeing the detective's business card, hurried to escort him to a private room on the first floor. Maurice Chastel was waiting for him standing, dressed in a burgundy velvet robe and a silk scarf around his neck. Tall, slim, with angular features and a sharp gaze, Chastel had the air of someone accustomed to not being contradicted. "Monsieur Poirot," he greeted with a gesture of restrained courtesy. "I'm surprised the gallery has turned to you so quickly. I suppose they believe a crime has been committed." Poirot sat down, his back straight, his hat carefully placed on his knees. "And you don't believe it, monsieur?" Chastel smiled sarcastically. "The only thing that's criminal is the way they've treated my painting. They relegated it to a corner, as if it were a decorative detail. The Lady in Blue, if I'm not mistaken. Correct. An early work by Delamere, one of the few that survived the fire in his studio in 1902. It's an irreplaceable piece." "And why did you decide to lend it?" "Social pressure," Chastel replied, frowning. "The gallery wanted to impress international collectors. They promised me a prominent position for the work. When I went to check, a total disappointment." Poirot looked at him closely. "And you thought about withdrawing it?" "Of course, but I knew causing a public scandal would be worse." "I held back, out of respect. For my name, for our reputation." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "And then he left without saying anything?" "That's right. I left before 9. I took a taxi in front of the gallery. You can check if you want." Poirot noted the fact, without commenting on his apparent need to offer alibis that had not yet been requested. "One last thing, sir. Are you aware that the painting's insurance covered only a fraction of its value?" Chastel frowned, offended. "Of course, I decided the amount myself. Insuring a project in its entirety is an invitation to theft. I prefer risk to criminal incentive." Poirot nodded slowly. "So you're not afraid of losing her?" "I'm afraid of losing what it represents. Not the canvas, but the lineage. That work was the first Delamere my grandfather owned. It's associated with family honour." Poirot stood up gently. "Thank you, Mr. Chastel. It was enlightening." As he descended the hotel stairs, Poirot could not help but repeat that phrase in têtu. His mind, not the canvas, but the lineage. The pride in the Chastel name was evident, almost flammable. Too great to allow a simple loss. Outside, the sky was beginning to clear, a few scattered clouds. Poirot got into a car and asked the driver to take him back to the gallery. It was time, he thought, to examine not what had disappeared, but what had remained, because sometimes what isn't stolen says more than what was lost. And in that silent selection, among canvases of equal or greater value that were still hanging intact, perhaps the first real clue was hidden. Chapter 4. The Value of the Untouched. Poirot returned to the Galerie Vernet that same afternoon, under a golden light that filtered through the upper windows and gave the rooms a sanctuary-like air. Upon his arrival, Madame Morel greeted him with a mixture of impatience and relief. "Monsieur Poirot, you have received the recordings, have you not?" "Oui, madame. I watched them all the way through last night, right up until dawn. Fascinating, in their silence. And even more fascinating, what they don't show." "What do you mean?" "No one comes in, no one goes out. The perfect robbery, isn't it?" So perfect that one might think the robbery never happened. Elise frowned at him. "Are you suggesting there was never a robbery?" "I suggest the scenario has been carefully composed, like a play with silent actors and an act that takes place off-stage." Poirot asked to be taken back to the Chastel room. This time, he carefully examined the frames of the neighbouring paintings, measuring distances, comparing heights, even the type of lighting directed at each work. He stopped before a portrait of an 18th-century nobleman. "This painting has a frame similar to the missing one, but its lighting is dimmer. Curious. Does that mean anything? Perhaps. Tell me, Madame Morel, who decided the final arrangement of the works for this gala? It was a joint decision among our curators, but I personally oversaw it. Maurice Chastel came to verify it. As I told you, he wasn't satisfied." "And was the painting moved at some point after that visit?" "No, not that I know of." Poirot thought for a moment and then asked, "Can I speak to one of the curators?" Elise nodded and called over the intercom. A few minutes later, Camille Duret appeared, a small woman with round glasses, nail-polish-stained hands, and a typically focused expression. "Monsieur Poirot," he greeted, wiping his fingers with a cloth. "I'm told you wish to ask me about the arrangements." "That's right, mademoiselle. Were you present during Monsieur Chastel's visit?" "Yes. He insisted that the lady in blue was supposed to occupy the central wall. He said it was the only one with sufficient symbolic weight." "And you were granted that position?" "No. Elise decided that that wall should be reserved for the Delacroix. She felt it would be the focal point of the evening. Chastel left indignantly." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And you, mademoiselle, when did you last see the painting?" 2 days before the gala. We checked the frames, the mounting, the protective glass. Everything was in order." Poirot walked slowly to the centre of the empty room. He pointed to the spot where the lady in blue. "Tell me one more thing. What was hanging here before Delamere's painting was put up?" Camille reflected. "A Van Dongen. Also a portrait, but more modern." We moved it to another room to make room for Chastel. Poirot turned to Elise. "I want to see the gallery's warehouse." They both looked at him, bewildered. "The warehouse?" "Oui, the places where no one looks, where paintings—" "Wait! Sometimes what disappears isn't far away. It just changes scenery. With each step into the bowels of the building, Poirot felt the pieces slowly begin to turn. Because in this gallery of vanities and inheritances, perhaps the painting hadn't been stolen out of ambition, but out of humiliation, and in that case, the culprit didn't want to sell it. He wanted to hide it, or protect it, or maybe punish with his absence. Chapter 5. The Painting That Didn't Want to Be Seen. The Galerie Vernet storeroom was on the lower levels of the building, accessible only through a master-keyed elevator and a white-walled hallway, where the echo of footsteps seemed even louder. Poirot descended accompanied by Elise Morel and Camille Duret, the latter holding an inventory book under his arm. "This is where we keep the works we're not displaying," Camille explained, opening a heavy steel door with a magnetic card. "This is also where the works we rotate or restore are." Upon entering, Poirot noted with appreciation the impeccable order: padded shelves, numbered frames with labels, an almost reverential atmosphere. Each painting seemed to sleep upright, covered with breathable fabrics. "A worthy resting place," he murmured. "Could you point out the works that were removed or moved during the preparations for the gala?" Camille consulted her notebook. "The Van Dongen, as I mentioned before. A portrait titled Woman with Cigarette was removed from the Sala Chastel and temporarily placed here. Also included are 2 early 19th century landscapes and an unsigned abstract painting." Poirot approached the corresponding section. His gaze scanned the frames like someone inspecting soldiers in formation. He stopped in front of a light grey linen cover. Gently, he removed the cloth. "Voilà," he whispered. There was the Van Dongen in its original frame, perfectly intact. Its vivid colours, sensual and modern lines, and the almost provocative pose of the woman portrayed contrasted with the serenity of classical portraits. "And this one?" asked Poirot, pointing to another gilt-framed canvas, partially covered by a blanket that seemed to have been hastily laid down. Camille approached. "That should be Bonnard's landscape, but—" He quickly lifted the canvas. Then he fell silent. "No, this can't be." Poirot narrowed his eyes. The picture revealed was, without a doubt, the Lady in Blue. The ethereal figure of the woman, wrapped in a sky-blue chiffon dress, with a melancholic and dreamy expression, now appeared before them. Unframed, undamaged, just displaced, hidden among works no one would review for weeks. "Impossible," Elise whispered. "We checked this place twice." Poirot smiled gently, naturally, because they were looking for a theft, not a concealment. "And as is often the case, madame, you only see what you expect to see." "But who would do something like that?" Camille asked, still perplexed. "And why?" Poirot stroked his moustache and turned away from the picture. "That's the next step. But now we know something essential. The crime wasn't motivated by greed. It was a message, and not for the public, but for someone else. They closed the cloth again over the Lady in Blue, with the same respect one would cover up an ancient secret. Poirot instructed them not to touch anything else. "We must keep this quiet," he ordered firmly, "until I know who placed the painting here and why. No one must know it's been found." Elise hesitated. "Do you mean we shouldn't bring it back to the room?" "Exactly. The culprit still believes he's gone unpunished. and I want to see what he does now that his masterpiece has been discovered." As they ascended in the elevator, Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. This was no longer a robbery. It was a carefully orchestrated act, a message without words. And like every good message, it had to have a recipient. The only mystery that remained was, who was the perpetrator, and what guilt was he trying to hide under layers of blue? Chapter 6. Midnight Silences. That night, Poirot didn't sleep. He sat at his small hotel desk with a cup of hot chocolate, surrounded by neatly arranged papers and a single lamp illuminating his notebook. On the center page, underlined with a double line, he had written, "The painting wasn't stolen. It was hidden. By whom? For what?" Possible motives were beginning to emerge. Professional jealousy, a desire for sabotage, or even, more intriguing, a form of personal warning. But warning to whom? The gallery? Chastel? Or even the lady in the portrait herself? At 8 o'clock in the morning, Poirot returned to the Galerie Vernet. No one else knew it, but that very morning the painting would be secretly removed from storage and taken to Madame Morel's private studio for temporary preservation. Camille would assist him personally. No one was to notice. When Elise received him in her office, Poirot observed her face carefully. "Madame, do you mind if I make a somewhat personal observation?" "Absolutely, Monsieur Poirot. You are more restless than yesterday." She hesitated. Then she nodded. "I received a letter this morning. No sender, no signature." Poirot extended his hand with a gentle but firm gesture. "Can I see her?" Elise took a thin envelope out of her purse. The letter was short, typed. "Some works are hidden not out of value, but out of shame. If you put it back on display, other secrets will also come to light." Poirot read it several times. Then, with a graceful movement, he took a magnifying glass from his pocket and examined the paper, the letters, the pressure of the keys. "It's not a vulgar threat. It's a carefully worded warning. Someone wants to prevent the lady in blue be seen again, but not for artistic reasons, but for personal ones. Do you think he's referring to me? Not necessarily. Do you know the identity of the woman in the picture?" Elise seemed to think about it for the first time. "No, I never asked." Chastel spoke of the painting as a symbol, not a real portrait. Poirot stood up with a suddenly animated air. "Then it's time to talk to the only one who can know, Edgar Delamere." Elise's eyes opened wide. "The painter? But wasn't he dead?" Poirot gave a slight smile. "That's what most people think. But Delamere faked his death for years to escape his creditors. Today he lives in the countryside under the name Émile Durand. I knew this a long time ago, but I never had the opportunity to confirm it. Now the opportunity has presented itself. And you think Delamere will tell you the truth? Sometimes, madame, artists are eager for their work to speak. But when their work has been misinterpreted, then they wish to speak." Poirot headed for the exit, picking up his hat. "If what I think is correct, the lady in blue, it's not just a valuable painting. It's the key to an all-too-human secret, one that someone is desperately trying to keep buried." And as he set off for the countryside where the enigmatic Émile Durand lived, Poirot knew that the solution to that mystery would lie not in evidence or alarms. It would lie in the memory of a man who had painted more than a figure. He had painted a truth, one that someone today was willing to silence at all costs. Chapter 7. The Painter and His Shadow. The village of Saint-Marc-le-Bois, 2 hours from Paris, seemed suspended in time. Its cobblestone paths and flowery gardens perfectly concealed the man once considered the cursed genius of modern portraiture. Edgar Delamere, now Émile Durand. Poirot arrived shortly after noon, guided by a contact from the Ministry of Culture, who had kept his secret for years. The house was modest but well kept, with geraniums in the window and an easel visible from the back terrace. A man with a white beard, hollow eyes, and hands still stained with paint greeted him with a mixture of distrust and resignation. "I don't usually receive visitors, Monsieur Poirot," he said without needing any introduction. "But if you've come all this way, I suppose it's she, the lady in blue." "Indeed," Poirot replied, sitting down carefully. "I need to know who she was, or is, because someone is trying to keep her hidden, and I fear that this intention goes beyond art." Durand closed his eyes for a moment, as if remembering a dream that hurts to wake up from. "She was my daughter," he finally said, his voice breaking. "Marguerite." Poirot didn't react immediately. He just nodded respectfully. "Your daughter? Wasn't she listed in any files?" "Because she wasn't a recognized daughter. She was the fruit of a forbidden love. Her mother was Louise Chastel, the wife of Maurice's grandfather." Poirot felt a pang in his chest. A new dimension opened like an unexpected curtain. So Maurice Chastel, he's her nephew-in-law. Marguerite was conceived during one of my commissions at the Chastel family chateau. Louise and I fell in love, and when they learned of the pregnancy, they sent her away. They forbade me to see her. She wrote me letters for years, many of which never reached me. When she died, I learned that Marguerite had been raised in secret, under another name. I never met her. I only had a photograph. And that's why I painted her. Not as she really was, but as I imagined her. Young, melancholic, filled with a sadness that I myself carried within me. Poirot remained silent, processing every word. And how did that painting end up in Maurice's hands? It was returned by an unscrupulous dealer. He had sold it after my false death. Maurice found it and, without knowing the story, added it to the family collection. But I have reason to believe that at some point he learned the truth. Poirot narrowed his eyes. And what did he do? He put it in a corner. He always kept it off-centre. He never referred to it by title. He called it the Blue Portrait. He never admitted the relationship. But I think he recognized the resemblance. He had a photo of Marguerite on his desk, identical to the one I used as a base. Poirot leaned towards him. And now someone has hidden that painting. Someone who fears what it represents. Durand nodded. Why the lady in blue? It's not just a painting. It's a mirror. And in it, some see a ghost they don't want to remember. As he left the house, Poirot felt a strange mixture of compassion and vertigo. The crime was no longer a simple act of disappearance. It was the denial of a truth that someone desperately wanted to bury, and the key wasn't in the painting itself, but in what it unleashed in those who viewed it. It was no longer a question of who had hidden the work. It was about who couldn't stand to look at her. And that someone, Poirot thought as he walked away, through the trees was about to make a second mistake. Because family secrets never die quietly. Chapter 8. The Second Silence. Poirot returned to Paris with an unusual weight on his shoulders. The train moved slowly through golden fields, while his gaze was lost in the window. Beside him, his notebook was open to a page, where he had written a single word, shame. Upon arriving at the Galerie Verneuil, he was greeted by a different atmosphere. There was no chaos, but there was a contained tension in the air, as if the walls themselves had heard something they shouldn't. Élise Morel led him directly to her office and closed the door with a grave expression. "Poirot, there's something you should know. Last night, Paul Leclerc didn't show up for his shift. And no one notified you. Etienne went to look for him at his home this morning." The door was closed. When they got no answer, they forced their way in. They found him unconscious. He had ingested a considerable dose of tranquilizers. Poirot remained motionless. Suicide attempt? It seems so. But they left a note, brief, ambiguous. She handed him the paper. Written on the same typewriter as the previous threat, it read, "I couldn't carry something that didn't belong to me." Poirot read the sentence 3 times. Then, very slowly, he sank into the armchair opposite her. It's not a confession, it's an exoneration, but it's also a warning. Someone else made him take on someone else's responsibility. Do you think someone used him as a pawn? Poirot didn't reply immediately. In his mind, Leclerc's nervous figure mingled with the faces of the other players. On the closed board, Élise, Lemoine, Camille. And of course, Maurice Chastel. Are you hospitalized? Yes. Stable, but sedated. He hasn't spoken to anyone yet. Poirot nodded slowly. We must protect him. Because what he did wasn't an act of guilt, but of desperation. And someone drove him to that point. He stood up and walked to the window, from where the main entrance to the gallery could be seen. In the distance, he recognized the elegant figure of Maurice Chastel, entering with a haughty gait and an inscrutable face. Poirot turned to Élise. I want to call a meeting. Discreet, tonight, in the Chastel room, with you, Monsieur Lemoine, Camille Duret, and, of course, Monsieur Chastel. The painting will be returned to its original place. No announcement, no audience, just us. I want to see how you react when you think everything is back to normal. What if the person responsible tries to act again? Poirot narrowed his eyes, his voice lower, more tense. That's exactly what I hope will happen. That night, shortly before 10 o'clock, the Sala Chastel regained its splendor. Under the warm light of the spotlights, the lady in blue hung once again in its allotted space. No one from the audience was present. Only those involved. Like actors waiting for a climactic scene they hadn't yet rehearsed. Poirot looked at them, one by one. Chastel, with his hands clasped behind his back. Camille, standing by the door, not daring to look directly at the painting. Élise, as rigid as a Florentine marble. And Etienne Lemoine, with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched. Silence was almost theatrical. Gentlemen, Poirot finally said calmly, the painting has returned, But the mystery remains. Who hid it? Why? And why did an innocent man choose to remain silent and almost die? Everyone fell silent. Only Chastel allowed himself a brief, disdainful smile. And you, Poirot? Do you already know? Not yet, but we're very close. This room, this work, and the story it represents are the crux of the matter. And tonight, when everyone thinks they can let their guard down, Poirot raised a finger. Someone will make another mistake, one that will reveal everything that's missing. And as the clock struck 10 o'clock, the echo of a distant door resonated through the corridors of the gallery. The game was not over. He had just begun his final act. Chapter 9. A Shadow Behind the Frame. The Chastel room remained bathed in light, but what reigned was an emotional gloom. The silence thickened among those present, like an invisible cloud that never ceased to expand. Poirot, standing beside the recovered painting, slowly turned on his heel to look at the gathered faces. He looked not only at what they expressed, but at what they tried not to show. "There's something curious about all this, my friends," he said, his tone gentle, almost casual. "A painting disappears, reappears unclaimed, and a man attempts to take his own life for something that wasn't even his doing." His words fell like drops on still water. Chastel frowned in barely contained annoyance. "Are you suggesting that one of us pushed that young man over the edge?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "I don't insinuate, monsieur. I observe, I interpret, and soon I will demonstrate." He approached the painting and looked at it for a few seconds. The lady in blue, a work that not only portrays a woman, but reveals a lineage. Marguerite, a Chastel, albeit hidden for convenience. The past always returns. Isn't that so, monsieur? Chastel didn't respond. He pressed his lips together, but his face had lost all colour. It was then that Camille Duret intervened. Her voice was low but firm. "I knew who the woman in the portrait was." Everyone turned to her. "How did you know?" asked Poirot without surprise. "Because years ago I worked on the restoration of that painting. And on the back of the canvas, beneath the stretcher frame, there was a hidden inscription for M, my daughter. It could only mean one thing." Poirot nodded, pleased. "And what did you do?" "I informed Madame Morel, privately." Everyone now turned to Elise, who nodded slowly. "I confirmed it with old documentation. I understood then that the painting wasn't just art, it was evidence, and I didn't know how to handle it. I thought it was better to say nothing." Poirot walked to the centre of the room. "And you, Monsieur Lemoine, did you know anything?" Etienne shook his head, though his gaze was fixed on Chastel. "Only Maurice wanted that painting away from the spotlight. He complained quietly. He said there were works that should never have been hung." "But he didn't act, did he?" "No, I had no reason." Poirot stopped in front of Chastel. "And you, sir, did you have one?" Chastel raised his head haughtily. "I wasn't going to allow a buried bastard to sully my family history." "It wasn't hatred toward the woman," he clarified, his voice trembling. "It was protection, honour. Marguerite was the fruit of betrayal. She had no right to be among us." "So you moved the painting? With your own hands?" Chastel hesitated. "No, it wasn't me, but—" I asked for it to disappear, for it to go missing. I told Leclerc to take it to the warehouse, to pretend it was lost." Poirot nodded. He approached Elise. "And you, madame, received the anonymous letter, the warning." "Yes, and I thought it was from Chastel." "It wasn't," Poirot corrected him. "It was from Paul Leclerc. A veiled plea. A young man caught between orders and conscience. That's why he didn't speak. That's why he broke down." There was absolute silence. Poirot walked towards the empty wall where the painting had been before its disappearance. This wasn't a crime of ambition or greed. It was a crime of shame. And like all shame, it poisoned in silence, hidden behind appearances and inheritances. Then he looked at Chastel with icy severity. "You didn't steal the painting, monsieur, but you erased it from your family's memory. That sometimes is more serious than any theft." Chastel looked down for the first time, and then, without words, he left the room. Poirot sighed slowly. The air cleared. "The truth," he said softly, "is like a masterpiece. It can be hidden, repainted, or hung in obscurity, but its essence never disappears." And with that, he turned his back on the painting, not to deny it, but because, finally, he could let it face the world without any more shadows behind the frame. Chapter 10. The Price of Forgetting. The next morning, the scandal had yet to break publicly, but inside the Galerie Vernet, everything had shifted a few degrees off its axis. The staff spoke in whispers. The curators walked with more measured steps, and Elise Morel's eyes were filled with a complex mix. Guilt, relief, and a worry she couldn't quite name. Poirot arrived punctually. He had requested a final conversation with everyone involved in private before allowing the gallery to resume normal operations. They met in the director's office where a kettle was steaming, with no one daring to pour anything. I don't wish to prolong this matter any longer than necessary," Poirot began, "but there is one last piece that must be put in place. A truth that has not yet been told. Not to accuse, but to fully understand what happened." Everyone waited in silence. Maurice Chastel wasn't present. He had left early that morning for the family estate in Lyon, leaving a brief note. "I have nothing more to say." Poirot looked at Camille Duret. "Mademoiselle, you were the first to read the hidden inscription on the canvas. I knew it could have consequences. However, you weren't the one who made the decision to hide the painting. Why? Because I was afraid. The Chastel name carries more weight than it seems. I knew that if I spoke openly, I could lose my position, my reputation. I thought Madame Morel would know how to handle it more delicately than I could." Poirot nodded. He turned to Elise. "And you, madame? You knew the painting was more than art. Why didn't you take action?" She looked down. "Because I feared that if I made it public, the Chastel family would withdraw their entire collection from the gallery, and without them, the gala would fail. Donations would cease. I was faced with a choice between protecting a personal truth or a cultural institution. And he chose the latter," said Poirot gently. "Yes, I'm deeply sorry." Poirot then turned to Etienne Lemoine. "And you, sir? Nothing to add. I knew Chastel had power, that Paul was weak, and that Madame Morel avoided confronting him. But I didn't want to intervene. I looked away. Poirot took a step towards the centre of the room. His words became calmer, more serious. A painting isn't just an image, it's an act of memory. The lady in Bluet wasn't just physically hidden. It was symbolically eliminated by those who didn't know how, or didn't want to, defend it. He paused, letting the words sink in. And Paul Leclerc, that silent, nervous young man who only wanted to work and obey, was pushed to the limit by all of you, out of cowardice, out of fear, out of convenience, not out of malice, no. But as so often happens, damage doesn't always need intent to be profound. Nobody said anything. Poirot took a deep breath. I won't take this to the authorities. There's no formal crime, just a restored truth, and many consciences that will have to hang their own invisible painting on the walls of their thoughts. He headed for the door, but before leaving, he turned around once more. The lady in Bluet will return to its place, and it will remain there, not as a tribute to the Chastels, but as justice for Marguerite, a woman who never asked to be included in anyone's story, but who, nevertheless, now occupies exact centre stage. And without another word, Poirot withdrew. In the gallery, visitors' footsteps began to echo through the rooms again. Art was breathing again, but deep within the building, where the truth had been buried by pride, a blue ghost, that of a forgotten daughter, finally smiled in silence. Chapter 11. Resting Grey Cells. That afternoon, Poirot returned to his apartment on the Rue des Martyrs, where a modest tray of warm rolls, a porcelain teapot, and the armchair by the window awaited him, arranged as if he knew the detective would return at that exact moment. The case was solved, at least in the formal sense. There would be no arrests or trials. Only truths returned to the surface, like long-submerged objects that, when they float, reveal what they tried to hide. With maniacal delicacy, Poirot placed his hat on the peg, took off his gloves, and poured himself a cup of tea. The steam rose in orderly spirals, like the thoughts now slowly arranging themselves in his mind. Funny, he murmured to himself. So many people gathered around a single painting, and not because of its price, but because of what it represented. Art, my friend, doesn't imitate life. It reveals it. He sat with his notebook open on his knees, reviewing his notes. Beside it, he placed a postcard. It was a picture of the lady in blue, discreetly taken by Camille before it was put on display. Again, on the back, a short line written by her. Thank you for giving back a name to what others wanted to erase. Poirot read it with a restrained, almost emotional expression. Then, with a solemn gesture, he tucked the postcard between the pages of his notebook and closed both with a small click. His thoughts turned to Paul Leclerc, still hospitalized but now conscious. Poirot had visited him that morning. The young man didn't say much, but his eyes, tired and filled with a strange peace, said more than any legal testimony. He had understood that he wasn't alone, that the truth, though silenced, had found a voice, and he also thought of Maurice Chastel, the last vestige of a family bent on preserving a purity that never existed. His silence was as revealing as his actions. Perhaps, in his retreat, he would recognize the damage. Perhaps not. But Poirot's justice rarely waited for external confirmation. He knew, and that was enough. On the other side of the window, the Parisian sky was beginning to turn orange. A light breeze stirred the curtains. Poirot, still holding the cup, closed his eyes for a few seconds. His mind, as sharp as ever, finally allowed the case to slip into the final file. "Not all guilty people end up in jail," he said softly, "but they all end up facing the mirror. And that, my God, is much more frightening." A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. It was the postman. A letter with a British letterhead. Poirot opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten invitation. "My dear Poirot, Scotland Yard requires your expertise in an unconventional case. A crime without a body, but with too many witnesses." Poirot smiled. Ah, Hastings! Always so dramatic. He sat up, smoothed the creases in his trousers, and went to find his suitcase. The tea was still steaming when he closed the door behind him. Because for Poirot, even when art is silent, enigmas never end. They're just waiting to be discovered, like a painting that disappears without a trace. Chapter 12. The Portrait of the Soul. 2 weeks after the incident at the Galerie Vernet, Paris had resumed its elegant and imperturbable rhythm. Exhibitions continued, collectors murmured over glasses of champagne, and critics wrote scathing reviews as if nothing had happened. But in one corner of the city, a work hanging in the centre of a room lit by a single spotlight continued to tell a truth that had previously been buried. The Lady in Bluet was no longer just a painting. It had become a symbol. Poirot returned to the gallery one last time to contemplate it alone. It was early morning. The room had not yet opened to the public. Elise Morel accompanied him silently, standing next to one of the columns. The air was cold, and the echo of her footsteps seemed fainter than usual. "Have you come to say goodbye, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked with a half-smile. "I've come to close the circle, madame, because not every mystery ends with the exposure of the culprit. Some end only when the wound is named." They both gazed at the painting in silence. The woman portrayed, Marguerite, seemed to be looking back at them, from a time when words were no longer used, and art spoke for them. "And you think we succeeded?" Elise asked. "That we did justice?" "We remembered," Poirot corrected gently, "and that sometimes is all justice can ever hope to be." Elise turned to him. "I've decided something. The Lady in Bluet will never be sold or loaned again. It will remain here with a new plaque telling its true story, with its real name." Poirot nodded, pleased. "Then, madame, you have done the right thing." "And Chastel? He's still in Lyon. Silent. He's resigned from the board of directors. But he sent me a letter." Elise raised an eyebrow. "And what did he say?" Poirot took a sheet of paper folded in 3 parts from his pocket. He unfolded it and read, "Marguerite deserved more. I regret not having the courage. But at least now, she's where she should be, facing the world, not in my shadow." They remained silent for a few more seconds. Poirot approached the painting and smoothed the bottom edge of its frame with his fingers, like someone smoothing a wrinkle in a shirt before an important event. "It's a portrait, yes, but also a confession. Not of the person who painted it, but of all those who hid it. a mirror that in the end everyone was forced to look into. Elise nodded. And you, Poirot? Will you be returning to Paris soon? Maybe. But for now, my little grey cells are clamouring for other enigmas. I received a letter from London. Hastings is waiting for me with a cup of tea and a bodiless corpse. Elise smiled. I wish you luck. Although, with you, I don't think it's necessary. Poirot bowed impeccably. Madame, crime can hide behind many layers. Money, power, even art. But in the end, it always reveals a crack. And that crack is where Poirot comes in. He said goodbye, slowly crossing the room as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows. Behind him, Marguerite's figure remained firm, serene, and for the first time in years, not forgotten. In the city of art, the most silent painting had spoken, and Hercule Poirot, with the truth restored, left with the satisfaction of knowing that not everything beautiful is hidden. Some beauties at last are vindicated.